Imagine being fined $5,000 by your HOA for having an ugly garden, only to have that same eyesore declared a historic landmark worth $500,000 the very next day. Sounds like the plot of a Netflix comedy, right? Nope. This actually happened. And it's one of the wildest HOA battles you'll ever hear about. Buckle up, because this story has petty neighbors, power-hungry board members, city officials with clipboards, and a twist ending so good it'll make you want to plant a cactus in the HOA president's driveway. Homeowners associations. 3 words that sound innocent enough, until you've actually lived under one. These mini-governments love to swoop in and tell you exactly what shade of beige your shutters should be, how tall your grass can grow, and whether your seasonal wreath is too festive for the neighborhood aesthetic. Our protagonist, let's call him Tom, is a quiet, middle-aged guy with a love for gardening. He isn't growing wild weeds or letting junk pile up in the yard. No, Tom's garden was a quirky mix of rare plants, heritage flowers, and heirloom vegetables. Think of it as a little slice of Mother Nature's chaos, right in the middle of a cookie-cutter HOA neighborhood where every lawn looks like it was copy-pasted from a Scott's Turf Builder ad. But here's the catch: what Tom saw as beauty, creativity, and heritage, the HOA board saw as blasphemy. And when HOAs see something they don't like, you can bet they'll pounce faster than a Karen spotting an unauthorized shade of mulch. It started small, as these things usually do. Tom came home one day to a bright yellow envelope taped to his door. Inside was a courtesy notice from the HOA. The letter read: "Your yard does not conform to the neighborhood standards. Please address the overgrowth and non-uniform plantings within 14 days to avoid further action."
Overgrowth, non-uniform planting.
Translation: your garden doesn't look like everyone else's, and that makes us itchy.
Tom looked it off.
He thought, surely they'll come around once they understand what I'm doing. He even wrote back to the HOA, explaining that his plants weren't weeds, they were carefully cultivated species, some of which had historic roots in the region going back over a century. The HOA's response?
Silence.
Until, of course, the second letter arrived. Because HOAs love escalation almost as much as they love clipboards and power trips. The second notice wasn't yellow. It was white, official, and cold. This time it came with a bill, $5,000 fine for violating neighborhood landscaping codes. $5,000. Tom nearly spit out his coffee when he read it. This wasn't some pocket change penalty. This was serious cash, over a garden that wasn't hurting anyone. The letter listed non-compliance with uniform landscaping requirements and detrimental impact on neighborhood aesthetics as the charges. Here's the irony: Tom's garden wasn't detrimental. Neighbors actually liked it. People would walk by, stop, and admire the unique flowers. Some even brought their kids over because Tom's yard attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. It was basically the neighborhood's free zoo exhibit. But the HOA board didn't care about butterflies, kids, or hummingbirds. They cared about control. And control in the hands of a bored HOA board can get as toxic as over-fertilized grass. Instead of paying up, Tom decided to appeal. He gathered photos of his garden, testimonials from neighbors, even notes from local horticulturists who praised the rare species he was growing. When the HOA held their hearing, Tom showed up with a binder thicker than a college biology textbook. He laid out his case point by point, calmly explaining that his garden wasn't just random, it was historic, ecological, and culturally significant. The HOA board? They barely glanced at the evidence. The president of the board, a woman we'll politely call Linda, leaned back in her chair, tapped her pen, and said, "Mr. Tom, this is not a botanical garden. This is a neighborhood. And your property must conform to the standards we've set. The fine stands." Boom.
Gavel drop.
HOA justice served. But little did Linda know, she was about to lose bigger than anyone in HOA history. Here's where things get cinematic. Tom wasn't done fighting. After the sham hearing, he decided to take his case beyond the HOA. He reached out to the city's Historic Preservation Committee. Why? Because some of his plants weren't just rare, they were tied to the region's history. For example, his heirloom roses had been grown in that county since the 1800s. His heritage corn was part of early farming traditions. And one of his massive oak trees? Over 150 years old. The city sent inspectors. Clipboards in hand, they walked through Tom's ugly garden, took notes, snapped photos, and compared everything against their records. A few weeks later, Tom got a letter. But this time it wasn't a fine. It was an official designation. Your property has been declared a historic landmark due to its preservation of heritage plant species and significant cultural value. Boom.
Instant réversal.
Tom's garden wasn't a violation, it was a protected site.
And the kicker?
That designation automatically boosted his property's value by nearly $500,000. From ugly garden to $500,000 landmark, in less time than it takes the HOA president to write a passive-aggressive email about trash cans. The fallout was delicious. The HOA had to immediately cancel the $5,000 fine, because legally, they couldn't touch a property that had landmark status. In fact, they were now forbidden from enforcing any changes to Tom's yard. Neighbors laughed, congratulated Tom, and even threw him a little block party to celebrate his win. Meanwhile, Linda, the HOA president, had to stand there, forced to smile, knowing her little crusade had backfired in the most humiliating way possible. And get this, the local news picked up the story. Headlines read, "Man's Garden Fined by HOA, Declare Historic Landmark Worth $500,000. The HOA became a punchline overnight. So what started as a $5,000 fine turned into one of the most spectacular HOA backfires in history. But we're just getting started. Because the ripple effects of this story go far beyond Tom's garden. They expose the way HOAs operate, how far they'll push for control, and what you can do if you ever find yourself in their crosshairs. You know that moment in movies where the villain realizes they've accidentally armed the hero with the very weapon that destroys them? That was our HOA president, Linda. Except instead of a sword, it was Tom's garden. And instead of a battlefield, it was a suburban cul-de-sac with overpriced HOA dues. Let's talk about how one fine turned into the HOA's most humiliating public disaster. When the news broke about Tom's yard being declared a historic landmark, the HOA board scrambled like ants at a picnic. Suddenly, the same neighbors who had been intimidated by HOA letters were emboldened. They started asking questions. Wait, if Tom's fine got wiped out, what about mine? Do they even have the authority to do half the things they threaten us with? If they can't touch Tom's landmark garden, what else are they powerless against? Linda, usually smug at meetings, now looked like a deer in headlights. She called an emergency HOA meeting to try and do damage control. But damage control turned into public roasting. Because once people smell weakness in an HOA board, it's like blood in the water, and every frustrated homeowner becomes a shark. Picture it, folding chairs in the community center, bad coffee in styrofoam cups, and Linda trying to hold her composure while neighbors asked the question she dreaded. One elderly man stood up. "Linda, if Tom's yard is worth $500,000 now, did you just cost the neighborhood money by trying to destroy it?" Another woman chimed in. "I got fined last month for leaving my Christmas lights up 2 days past the deadline. Was that even legal?" The board squirmed. Their carefully cultivated authority was unraveling right in front of them. Tom didn't even have to say much. He just sat there, sipping his coffee, like the star witness at a trial that the prosecution had already lost. By the end of the meeting, half the neighborhood was openly laughing at Linda's attempt to spin things. Some even suggested she step down as president. And trust me, nothing bruises an HOA president's ego more than realizing their neighbors think they're a glorified hall monitor with a clipboard. Local reporters had a field day with the story. Headlines popped up everywhere. HOA fines man for garden. City calls it priceless. From ugly to untouchable, garden declared landmark. HOA backfires big, homeowner wins huge. News vans parked on Tom Street. Reporters wanted to interview him in front of his ugly garden, which now looked more like a royal palace compared to the HOA's beige lawns. The more Tom's story spread, the more the HOA looked ridiculous. Linda refused interviews, which only made her seem guiltier. Tom, on the other hand, handled it with grace. He explained that he never wanted to embarrass anyone, he just wanted his garden to be respected. But in every interview, he slipped in a subtle reminder. This isn't about me. It's about homeowners standing up when rules cross the line into abuse. That line went viral. Homeowners across the country shared it on social media. Suddenly, Tom wasn't just the guy with the landmark garden. He was a symbol of resistance against HOA tyranny. And symbols spread faster than weeds in a lawn the HOA forgot to spray. Behind the scenes, Linda was spiraling. She had built her entire identity around being the guardian of neighborhood standards. She was the type who bragged about keeping property values high at every dinner party. But now, her decisions had not only cost the HOA credibility, they'd actually boosted Tom's property value. The exact opposite of what she claimed to stand for. Some neighbors started petitions to remove her from the board. Others openly mocked her in the community Facebook group. One even posted a meme with her face photoshopped onto a gardener pulling weeds, captioned, "Linda, protecting us from flowers since 2023. It was brutal. And honestly, beautiful. But while Linda was busy losing face, Tom was busy gaining something even bigger, leverage. With landmark status, Tom's property was now untouchable by HOA rules. They couldn't demand paint changes, landscaping adjustments, or even holiday decorations. His house was essentially Switzerland, neutral and independent, smack in the middle of HOA territory. Neighbors noticed. They started approaching him privately. "Hey Tom, how'd you pull that off? Can you help me fight my fine? Do you think the city would protect my old oak tree too?" Tom had gone from quiet gardener to local hero. He didn't just win his battle, he had created a blueprint for others to challenge the HOA. And nothing terrifies an HOA board more than a neighborhood full of empowered homeowners who realize the emperor has no clothes. And the emperor, in this case, was wearing khakis and holding a gavel. The story even caught the attention of national outlets. HOA horror stories were nothing new, but this one had all the ingredients of a viral news cycle. A greedy HOA overstepping. A twist ending where the ugly garden becomes worth $500,000. A homeowner who stayed calm, smart, and relentless. People everywhere began asking, "If Tom can do this, what can I do to push back against my HOA?" Lawyers started offering free consultations to homeowners who thought they'd been unfairly fined. Cities began reviewing their own preservation lists, wondering if they had overlooked historic properties. The ripple effects were massive. And all of it, from national headlines to legal reforms, started with a single letter taped to Tom's door. So here's where we're at. The HOA is humiliated, the neighbors are emboldened, and Tom's garden isn't just growing plants, it's growing a movement. But this saga isn't done yet. Because when you embarrass an HOA, you don't just get apologies. You get retaliation. And in part 3, we'll dive into exactly how far Linda and her clipboard army were willing to go to try and claw back their power. If you thought Linda and her HOA board were going to admit defeat gracefully, you must be new here.
HOA don't back down. No, they double down.
They'd rather light themselves on fire than hand over the match. So when Tom's garden went viral, the board decided to fight back. But here's the kicker: the harder they fought, the deeper they dug their own grave. After the humiliation of the emergency meeting and the media circus, Linda called her board into crisis mode. Their mission? To find any possible loophole to punish Tom. Some of their ideas were so absurd, it's almost laughable. Try to fine him for hosting too much foot traffic, because reporters were visiting. Claim that his garden statues were unauthorized structures. Suggest that the landmark designation only covered the plants, not the ugly birdbath in the middle. They were literally sitting around a table brainstorming ways to attack a man who just had his property protected by the city. It was like trying to fight a tank with a water gun. Because here's the thing about HOA boards: once they get a taste of control, losing it feels like starvation. And Linda was starving. The first shot fired was another letter. Bold, underlined, and full of threatening legal jargon. Tom's reaction? He chuckled, poured himself another coffee, and pinned it on his fridge like a kid's artwork. The HOA claimed his foot traffic was disturbing the neighborhood. They demanded he limit visitors.
Thomas' réponse?
He forwarded the letter to the city's preservation office.
The repli came back fast.
As a landmark, Mr. Henderson's property is protected under state law. Any attempt to limit access could be considered interference with a cultural site.
Translation: Hoa, sit down.
When Tom shared that email in the community Facebook group, neighbors lost it. One wrote, "So the HOA just tried to fine a landmark for having visitors? Are they insane?" Another joked, "What's next, a curfew for the flowers?" Linda's letter strategy had officially backfired. And when your threats turn into memes, you know you've lost the war. The surveillance stunt. But Linda wasn't done. If she couldn't win with fines, she'd try intimidation. She actually convinced the board to approve installing security cameras aimed directly at Tom's yard. Their excuse? Monitoring unusual activity. When Tom noticed them, he didn't blow up. He didn't call the cops. He did something better. He called a reporter. The next day, a local headline read, HOA installs cameras to monitor historic garden. The photo showed two bulky cameras pointed straight at Tom's roses like they were plotting a heist. The community was outraged. Neighbors felt violated, too. If they were spying on Tom, who else were they spying on? Parents worried about kids playing outside. Couples worried about backyard privacy. What was meant to intimidate Tom ended up alienating the entire neighborhood. And that's when Linda discovered the golden rule of petty power grabs. The more you squeeze, the faster control slips through your fingers. The breaking point came when the HOA tried to escalate things legally. They hired an attorney, at HOA expense, mind you, to draft a lawsuit claiming Tom's landmark status unfairly exempted him from community standards. The irony? The lawyer basically laughed them out of the office. The law was crystal clear. Once landmarked, a property wasn't subject to HOA landscaping rules. End of story. But here's the kicker. HOA funds had already been drained paying legal fees for this nonsense. When homeowners found out their dues were being wasted to harass Tom, they were livid.
One résident demandait un financial audit.
The results? Shocking. Thousands spent on consulting fees to chase Tom.
Over budget, surveillance initiative.
Misused reserve funds to cover legal bills. The HOA's dirty laundry was now fully exposed. And let me tell you, nothing unites a neighborhood faster than realizing their money's being flushed down the legal toilet. While the HOA spiraled, Tom stayed cool. He didn't rant, didn't escalate. He just kept showing receipts. Every time the HOA sent a threat, Tom responded with documentation from the city or preservation office, proving they had no jurisdiction. Neighbors began to call him the professor, because he turned every HOA stunt into a teachable moment. Here's how you request public records of HOA finances. Here's how to file a complaint with city code enforcement. Here's how to challenge unfair fines. It was like a masterclass in homeowner rights, and the whole neighborhood was taking notes. Suddenly, people who had quietly paid fines in the past started fighting back. Linda had created her own resistance movement by targeting the wrong guy. And if this were chess, Linda was down to her last pawn, while Tom was casually sipping tea with 3 queens on the board. The final straw came when 2 board members resigned. They claimed they were tired of Linda's personal vendetta, draining the HOA's credibility. One even gave a statement to the local paper, saying, "We joined the HOA to support the community, not to settle one person's grudge against a garden." That line hit harder than any lawsuit. The HOA board was now fractured. The neighborhood was openly rebelling, and Linda's reputation was toast. Meanwhile, Tom's garden? Still standing. Still beautiful. And now worth $500,000. But the story doesn't end with Linda's fall. Because what Tom did next turned this personal victory into a legacy. Tom could have stopped there, victorious, vindicated, and vindicatively sipping lemonade while Linda sulked. But he didn't. He took his fight one step further. In Part 4, we'll dive into how Tom transformed his garden from a personal sanctuary into something even bigger, a community landmark that would outlive the HOA itself. Here's the thing about winning a war: you can either hang up your boots and enjoy the peace, or you can build something so powerful that your enemies regret ever starting the fight. And Tom? Oh, he didn't just plant roses, he planted a revolution. His garden wasn't just about flowers anymore. It was about community, history, and a giant middle finger to every HOA that thought power was more important than people. After the HOA board imploded and Linda's credibility tanked, Tom could have sat back, admired his $500,000 ugly garden, and enjoyed the victory. But Tom wasn't done. Instead, he decided to turn his property into something even bigger than a yard with historic status. With help from the city's preservation office, Tom's landmarked garden officially became a community heritage site. That meant guided tours, educational events, and even funding grants to help preserve it. Imagine that, The same HOA that tried to bulldoze his roses was now legally required to respect the landmark that drew more people to the neighborhood than their annual block party ever did.
The HOA wanted control?
Too bad, the city had stepped in, and Tom now had more allies than Linda could ever imagine. And if Linda thought this was over, she was about to realize something brutal. When you turn one person's garden into a community symbol, you can't just kill it, you'd have to kill the entire spirit of the neighborhood. It started with small gestures. Neighbors who had once stayed quiet suddenly started visiting Tom's yard, offering to help weed, prune, and maintain the historic roses. Families took weekend strolls past his house, treating it like a mini park. School teachers organized field trips for kids to learn about local history and preservation laws. And Tom? He welcomed everyone with open arms. For the first time, people in the neighborhood began to see the HOA not as their protector, but as an obstacle to real community life. The garden became a physical reminder that the HOA didn't always represent the people, they represented themselves. When neighbors pick sides and the garden wins by a landslide, the HOA isn't just losing power, it's losing relevance. Now, let's pause for a second. You're probably wondering, where's Linda? Did she give up? Did she resign? Did she take up knitting instead of policing lawns? Nope. She tried one last desperate move. Linda pushed for a new HOA bylaw, one that would regulate community tourism, to preserve neighborhood tranquility. In other words, she wanted to ban people from visiting Tom's garden. Here's the problem: bylaws can't override state preservation laws. The city shot her proposal down before it even made it past the first review. The cherry on top. A reporter covering the debacle quoted a city official saying, "Community heritage sites are meant to be enjoyed. Attempting to restrict access undermines their purpose." That line went viral. Linda's attempt to block visitors made her look even pettier. And when you've become the villain in your own neighborhood story, there's no HOA bylaw strong enough to save your image. Tom knew the HOA drama wouldn't vanish overnight, so he decided to make his win permanent. He set up a non-profit foundation tied to the landmark garden. Its mission? To promote preservation, homeowner education, and community empowerment. He wasn't just protecting his yard, he was giving people the tools to protect their rights against HOAs everywhere. Suddenly, Tom was speaking at city council meetings, getting invited to local radio shows, and even fielding questions from neighboring towns about how they could landmark their own community gems. The garden that started as a personal passion project had become a movement. See, Linda tried to uproot flowers. Instead, she ended up planting the seeds of a rebellion. The biggest sign of change came at the next HOA election. Normally, these meetings were snooze fests, half-empty rooms, a few retirees nodding off, Linda getting re-elected by default. This time, the place was packed. Dozens of homeowners, many of whom had never bothered showing up before, crowded into the meeting hall. And they weren't there to support Linda, they were there to vote her out. Speeches were made. Tempers flared. One neighbor stood up and said bluntly, "This HOA doesn't represent us anymore. It represents Linda's grudge. And we're done paying for it." The vote wasn't even close. Linda was ousted, and a new board was sworn in, a board that promised transparency, accountability, and most importantly, respect for the community. Tom didn't run for office. He didn't need to. His influence was already bigger than any HOA title. And that, my friends, is the irony. The garden Linda tried to destroy didn't just survive, it toppled her reign. By the end of the year, Tom's once-ugly garden was being featured in magazines, celebrated at local festivals, and listed on tourist maps. The city even announced plans to include it in their annual heritage tour, alongside historic homes and monuments. But the impact went deeper than that. Homeowners across town started questioning their own HOAs. Other neighborhoods began filing for landmark status to protect unique features. And Linda? She quietly sold her house and moved away, unable to live in the shadow of the garden she tried so hard to erase. And that's the thing about power: when it's hoarded, it collapses. But when it's shared, it grows roots deeper than any HOA can ever cut down. Tom didn't just save his garden. He saved his neighborhood. And in Part 5, we'll close this story by showing you how his fight turned into a blueprint for communities everywhere, proof that even the ugliest battles can grow into the most beautiful victories. Okay, so we've seen Tom take on the HOA, expose the corruption, watch the city flip the script, and turn his so-called ugly garden into a $500,000 landmark. But here's the real question: what happens next? Because in HOA-WARS, the battle doesn't end when the gavel drops. It ends when the neighborhood changes forever. And this? This is where Tom's story goes from one man's victory to a playbook for every homeowner across America. Most people, after a win like Tom's, would grab a glass of wine, sit back in their recliner, and enjoy their new status as the guy who beat the HOA. Not Tom. See, Tom understood something most people don't. If you don't turn your victory into a blueprint, history repeats itself. And Linda's downfall was proof that HOAs could, and often did, abuse power if nobody was paying attention. So Tom decided to turn his experience into a manual. He wrote down every step, every tactic, every law, and every loophole that saved his garden. He documented the evidence, the city's involvement, and the power of community organizing. He called it the Homeowner's Survival Guide, Fighting Back Against HOA Tyranny. It wasn't just a pamphlet. It was practically a war manual. And here's where things get spicy. That little guide didn't stay in Tom's drawer. It spread like wildfire. At first, Tom just shared the guide with a few neighbors. Then one of them posted it in a homeowner's Facebook group. Then another uploaded it to Reddit. Within weeks, Tom's name was popping up in forums across the country. Did you hear about the guy who turned his ugly garden into a historic landmark and destroyed his HOA? It became legend. Local news did follow-up stories. A podcast invited Tom to share his story. A regional magazine featured him under the headline, "The Rose Garden That Took Down an HOA." And here's the kicker: Tom didn't ask for fame. It found him. Suddenly, homeowners across the country were emailing him, asking for advice. How do I landmark my property? What evidence do I need to fight back? Can you help me with my HOA nightmare? Tom wasn't just a gardener anymore. He was an advocate. And if you thought one garden couldn't spark a movement, well, grab your watering can, because this thing was about to grow roots nationwide. Remember Linda's meltdown? Multiply that by 100, and you'll get the reaction from HOAs across the country when Tom's story started making headlines. Board members began scrambling to review their bylaws. Some even hosted emergency meetings to reassure their communities. Why? Because suddenly, homeowners weren't afraid anymore. They had proof that standing up worked. HOA lawyers warned their clients, don't underestimate this case. Courts and city councils are paying attention now. In one state, legislators even cited Tom's case during a hearing on HOA reform. Imagine that, your rose bushes helping shape state law. When your garden ends up in the same conversation as state legislation, you're not just planting flowers, you're planting reform. Back in Tom's own neighborhood, the ripple effects were massive. The new HOA board slashed fees, opened financial records to everyone, and focused on actual improvements, like fixing the pool, resurfacing sidewalks, and planting more community gardens. The culture shift was undeniable. People who once avoided HOA meetings now packed the room, not out of fear, but excitement. Kids drew posters of Tom's garden for school projects. Local businesses even sponsored garden events, turning the neighborhood into a mini tourist attraction. It wasn't just about one man's win anymore, it was about a community reborn. Back in Tom's own neighborhood, the ripple effects were massive. The new HOA board slashed fees, opened financial records to everyone, and focused on actual improvements, like fixing the pool, resurfacing sidewalks, and planting more community gardens. The culture shift was undeniable. People who once avoided HOA meetings now packed the room, not out of fear, but excitement. Kids drew posters of Tom's garden for school projects. Local businesses even sponsored garden events, turning the neighborhood into a mini tourist attraction. It wasn't just about one man's win anymore, it was about a community reborn. And if you think that's where the story ends, oh no. Because Tom had one final card to play. 6 months later, Tom was invited to testify before a state Senate committee on HOA reform. He walked in with his binder of evidence, the same one he once slammed on Linda's table, and laid out the blueprint for protecting homeowners. His testimony hit like a thunderclap. Lawmakers nodded. Reporters scribbled. Homeowners watching from the gallery clapped. The phrase "Tom's garden case" became shorthand for reform. His fight wasn't just a story, it was precedent. And let's be real, once your garden makes it into legislative history books, you've officially leveled up from neighbor with roses to full-blown legend. Today, Tom's garden is more than a patch of roses. It's a landmark, a community hub, and a national symbol of resistance against unchecked HOA power. Kids still run tours through it during school field trips. Families take photos in front of it every spring. And homeowners everywhere whisper about it when they stand up to their own HOAs. Tom himself stays humble. If you ask him, he'll say, "I just wanted to save my roses." But we know better. He didn't just save his roses. He saved his neighborhood, inspired a movement, and proved that even the smallest garden can bloom into the biggest victory. So here's the takeaway. When your HOA tries to fine you for an ugly garden, don't just pay up, dig in. Document, fight, and if you have to, turn your roses into a weapon of mass HOA destruction. Because in the end, the ugliest thing in any neighborhood isn't an overgrown bush or a historic landmark, it's unchecked power. And as Tom proved, power only wins when people stop fighting. Now let me ask you, what's your HOA horror story? Drop it in the comments below, because I guarantee, someone out there needs to hear it. And hey, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and join the army of HOA warriors making sure no one else gets fined into silence. Because remember, roses may have thorns, but homeowners? We've got roots. And roots always win.